Are we ready? Okay. Well, good afternoon. Welcome all to this event. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Rosa Celorio. I actually serve as Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law at GW Law School. Is this better? This better? Okay. Well, just one? Okay. I'm going to put this one in the back. There, let's do that. Thank you.
Oh, this one? Yeah.
Does this sound better? Thank you. Does this sound better? Yes, we have to make sure the sound works well, you know? So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor to be here with Ambassador William Taylor and all of the other speakers that we're gonna have here today address you. And I have to say, you know, it's a very important event, but we do start with a very somber tone. As I was preparing this event, I remember 2 years ago, all the events that we did at the law school, you know, when Russia's invasion to the Ukraine first started, and all of the reminders, you know, that we were making to the international community of the gravity of this conflict, of the importance of international law, of the human rights and humanitarian implications, you know, and in some ways, you know, even though I'm very happy to be here with you today, it's also a moment to reflect. You know, we still have a very alarming armed conflict happening, you know, and I'm so incredibly grateful to Vitalina Pushatska, who's our LLM student who put together this event for opening a space for us to have this very important reflection. And there's not enough good things that you can say about Vitalina Pushatska. You know, she's deeply affected by this conflict, but she's also a tremendous attorney, activist, legal thinker. We're incredibly proud to have her at this law school. And for me, it is an incredible honor and privilege that we're hosting her event today. And she has worked tirelessly to make sure that this event took place as well. I also want to thank profusely Professor Sean Murphy, who's here, also Professor Leah Calabro, who's here, who really also guided, you know, this event in every step of the way. And I just want to say, Ambassador Taylor, you have so many admirers at the law school, you know, for so many reasons. I'm going to read your bio in a little bit, you know, to make sure that everybody present is aware, you know, of all the achievements. And I'm so incredibly honored that you are here today. And one thing that you should know about Ambassador Taylor is that he was just at the U.S. Institute of Peace moderating a panel full of ambassadors, you know, right before coming here. It kind of gives you an idea, you know, of how dynamic, you know, how important, you know, how groundbreaking in many ways his work has been, you know, in this area and still is at the global level. So it's really an honor to have you with us today. And I just want to say that we're going to have this first part, you know, in which he's going to give us keynote remarks, you know, on Russia and the Ukraine, especially 2 years after the war. We're going to be discussing, you know, what those 2 years mean, you know, the road to peace and justice. We know this is a very difficult road, but we're still very hopeful. You know, this is why we're still meeting today, but we're also going to have fantastic practitioners join us in a little bit. So I hope you stay around. We're going to have Marnie Cheek, who's a partner and co-chair of International Arbitration and Disputes at Covington and Burley. We're also going to have Anna Dion, who's a senior program officer for police reform at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and also Yuri Parkomenko, you know, who's a partner in international litigation and arbitration at Foley Hoag. And I just want to say that I think it's very important to start by recognizing the alarming nature of what continues happening in the Ukraine. There's so many words that you can use, you know, to describe, you know, the gravity and scale of this war. You can say, you know, that we've had reactions, you know, of alarm, horror, outrage, tragedy, and formidable human suffering. And this is a war that's not only affecting the Ukraine, but has very massive international implications. And it's also making us re-question in many ways what should we do or how we should move ahead with international law today, and also our rules-based order as well. And basically every area of international law, is impacted in some way, in a conflict like this. We're talking about refugee law, humanitarian law, international criminal law, human rights law, economic law, and many others as well. And I just want to also salute, and underscore the strength, of, those in the Ukraine who are resisting this war with grit, with defiance, with determination, with resilience. They're fighting for their self-determination, and this is a basic human right. This is a basic tenet of international law. And from our ICL program, we continue sending a message of support and solidarity to all of those affected by this armed conflict, including our students and alums, and some of them are here with us today. And I just want to say, just underscore two recent developments. One of them is that we're still seeing, the arduous road, to secure aid, for the Ukraine, when it comes to fighting this war. But also we had the very tragic death, of Alexei Navalny as well, which we're going to be discussing today, the chief Russian opposition leader in very suspicious circumstances while in prison in Russia. So definitely a lot to talk about. So I do hope that you stay with us for the entire duration of this event. I also want to thank our co-sponsors. We have here the GW School of Media and Public Affairs. Thank you so much for being here. We also have the Ukrainian American Student Association, and we're very honored as an international comparative law program to host this event. And without further ado, I want to introduce our main speaker, our keynote speaker, Ambassador William Taylor. He's Vice President for Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he has a very long bio.
Don't read it.
So it's difficult to do him justice. He's done a lot, so we have a lot of respect for your career, but just a few notes. He served as Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev and as U.S. Ambassador to the Ukraine between 2006 and 2009, and also during the Arab Spring. He oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. In the 1990s, he coordinated U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and he earlier served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. He's also a graduate of West Point and the Harvard's Kennedy School, and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor. And in terms of format, what we're going to do is, this is more of a conversation. I'm going to ask the ambassador a number of questions, and then after we have some dialogue, we're going to open the floor for some questions in the audience. Is this okay?
Good idea.
Wonderful. So I wanted to ask you a first, more general question, about Russia and the Ukraine and the ongoing conflict. How has global diplomatic strategy towards Russia's war against the Ukraine evolved over the past 2 years? And what would be your key takeaways from 2 years of the war?
First of all, Dean, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I do look forward to the questions and comments and suggestions that we may generate during both this talk as well as the rest of the day. It's a great thing. And let me also just say how impressed I am with Vita and how she has put this together at her own initiative, driving force on this thing. She represents Ukraine well, I will say. She's a great representative of Ukraine. The commitment, the determination, you've mentioned the kind of grit that they've displayed over these last 2 years, last 10 years. Now let's remember that the initial invasion of Ukraine was 10 years ago. When the Russians invaded Crimea, and then Donbass, and then a long period of kind of low-level conflict, low-level except 14,000 Ukrainians died during that time, up until February 2022 when they invaded with the full-fledged invasion. And so that's what we're talking about the last 2 years. So the initial horror and surprise that was there for most of us, many of us. So I was in Kyiv in January of 2022, 3 weeks before the big invasion. I was there with a group of people. A couple of us sat down with President Zelensky. We also sat down with opposition leaders. At that time, again, before the war, President Zelensky had been in office for, a little over 2 years. And what happens after he was elected, you remember in 2019, with 73% of the vote, when you govern for a couple of years, that rating goes down. We know about how this happens in democracies. And so in conversation with him, he had gotten the briefings about what the Russians were about to do. And our CIA had been there, briefed him very clearly on what was about to happen. They were pretty sure. He heard those. His military heard those, and the military took some precautions. But no one wanted to believe that this was actually going to happen. He remembers very clearly doing some things to get prepared for that. But you asked about how, over time, the diplomatic efforts. I mentioned this first part because it was a shock that the Russians had violated all of the principles, all of the treaties, all of the understandings that they or the Soviets had signed up to. They had committed to the security of Ukraine. When Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994, it had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons that inherited from the Soviet Union, gave them up, destroyed some, sent some back to Russia. Why? In return for what? A commitment, an assurance from the Russians, from the Americans, from the Brits, that their security would be respected. There would be guaranteed. They thought the word was guaranteed. We thought the word was assured. There was a distinction there, and the international lawyers will look at this question. But there was a clear commitment on the part of the Russians, the Brits, the Americans, that the security of Ukraine would not be challenged. And we know what happened. We know what happened in 2014. We know what happened in 2022. So the violation of international law has been blatant. And then the question is how to get back to a respect for those principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that are embedded in international law, that are embedded in treaties, that are embedded in the UN Charter, that guides relations among nations on the legal sphere and political sphere, and the respect for sovereignty, that all nations, big or small, are sovereign, and that borders are not to be violated. Those principles had somehow kept the peace, if you will, since 1945. Not totally. We know there were wars. I fought in one, the Korean War. We remember wars in the Balkans. But during that time, from 45 until 2014, there was not a major war among big powers. So then, and why? Because of this respect for sovereignty, because of the respect for principles that kept that, and that was violated. So the question then for diplomats, international lawyers, for nations is, can we get back to some kind of an agreement, some kind of an order that kept that peace in some sense? In order to do that, the Russians have to get out of Ukraine. There's no way that the international community can allow the Russians to stay in Ukraine, take part of its territory, occupy part of its land, as you mentioned, torture many of its people, There has to be some accountability, some agreement that can't happen again. So there are a lot of aspects of now. One of the things that has emerged that we'll probably talk about here during this day is an attempt, a commitment to accountability, to hold Russians, starting at the top, accountable for those decisions that they made. The first big decision was the decision to invade. This is the crime of aggression. Hard to pursue the criminal here. The crime of aggression, obviously Mr. Putin and his immediate entourage. However, the International Court of Justice has done some things, but the International Criminal Court has found that President Putin is responsible, has indicted him as a war criminal for one of the crimes, abduction of Ukrainian children. This is to say that there are efforts to hold the Russians accountable. There are efforts to look for solutions to this conflict that maintain the respect for sovereignty, Ukraine's sovereignty in this case, Ukraine's boundaries, in a way that can bring us back to an order that we can live with going forward.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. And I have a question for you. You just stated, one of the biggest concerns that we have, right, with this conflict, the need for justice, for accountability, and the need to go back or return, to that respect of international law in the world order. But there's also the issue of negotiations, negotiations between Russia and the Ukraine. Historically, negotiations, or what we call this transitional, justice, is not necessarily, led us to that justice and accountability, or even that respect of international law. There have been things that have been sacrificed, in the negotiations, to obtain peace, So how do you see a potential negotiation process between the Russia and the Ukraine? If you even think, this is viable, what do you think are the main challenges, and what would be your views, in light of all that we need in the area of international law as well?
Dean, great question on negotiations. This is a topic of discussion in Ukraine. It's a topic of discussion in this city. The Ukrainians have said that they're open to negotiations, and indeed they've got a plan. They've got a well-developed 10-point plan that they have put forward to the international community in 4 different settings, international settings, and these points are very understandable. I mean, one of the points is these principles that we already talked about, principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also of food security is one of the points. Nuclear security is one of the points. Return of prisoners and children is one of the points. Removal of Russian soldiers from Ukraine is one of the points. So they have an outline. They have a structure. The Russians have said, we're willing to negotiate as well if the Ukrainians effectively surrender. If the Ukrainians give up claim to the territory that the Russians now occupy, which is about 20% of Ukraine's territory, it's about 18%. And the Russians have said, we'll take that, and then we'll negotiate. We'll have this conversation. The Ukrainians are not interested in that kind of a negotiation. So the Russians don't appear to be interested when they put down their demands. The Ukrainians have a proposal, but it does have the Russians leaving the country. So for now, the negotiations are not taking place. They took place for a while, for a short period of time, right at the beginning. So in February, late February and March of 2022, the Russians and Ukrainians had delegations meet on the border of Belarus for a couple of times. And then they shifted down to Turkey. And the Turks were providing some support for these negotiations. And again, this is the first 2 months of the war. And during that 2 months, as we remember, the Russians actually pushed well into Ukraine and got very close to Kiev, very, very close to the capital. When you visit, 20 minutes from downtown Kiev is the town of Bucha. The Russians occupied Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel, these villages up to the north of Kiev, for 6 weeks. And during that 6-week time, there were beginnings of these negotiations on the Belarusian border and then down into Turkey. But about 6 weeks in, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back out. They stopped the Russians from coming into Kiev. The tanks were close, and the Russians pushed them back. The Russians already had assassination squads in Kiev looking for President Zelensky to try to put a puppet government there. The Ukrainians resisted, not only stopped them, pushed them back. When the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back, they liberated Bucha and Irpin and Hostomel. And they were horrified at what they found. The killings, the assassinations, the mass graves, the rape, the tortures, the kidnapping of children, again, for which Putin is an indicted war criminal, were horrifying, and that stopped the negotiations. The Ukrainians said they were horrified, and they could not continue negotiations with these kind of people. So all to say that there may be negotiations in the future. When the Ukrainians are ready, and they say when they've pushed the Russians back, then the Russians may want to negotiate, and the Ukrainians will negotiate. They've got a plan. So far, the Russians don't seem serious about it. That's kind of where the negotiations stand.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. You referred to one of the aspects of this war that has most horrified the world, right? Atrocity crimes, large-scale crimes, and happening in broad daylight, very documented on TV, something that we're not used to seeing on TV, even though we know this occurs. And then suddenly we have the tragic death of Alexei Navalny in this context, right? And this is a death that has shaken the world in many ways. It has dominated international attention. There's a lot of scrutiny involved, not only in the death, but as you know, all these international bodies had actually expressed their concern, over Alexei Navalny over the years. What do you think could be the impact of this death, on the dynamics that we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
So what the death of Alexei Navalny shows us is the nature of this regime in the Kremlin. Sad to say. The repression imposed on the Russian people is as bad now as in the depths of Soviet times. Some people say worse. On late Soviet times. And President Putin will not allow any competition whatsoever. Alexei Navalny was his lead opponent, was not afraid to point out the corruption, point out the violations of human rights, violation of political rights of Russians, and they put him in the farthest prison that they could find, above the Arctic Circle. They knew that he was ill. They poisoned him twice, maybe a dozen other times. They knew that he would die. So they're clearly responsible for this death. This is a measure, an indication of the regime that sadly we're dealing with in the Kremlin. This is an issue for the Russians. The Russians are going to have to decide how they react to this. So far, because of this repression, there hasn't been much. President Putin has even put into, removed from the ballot another person who was not anywhere near as recognized as Alexei Navalny, Nadezhnin. And here's a man who had been a member of the Duma, and then found his voice and said, you know, actually, that war in Ukraine is a mistake. And the Russians said, wow, nobody's been willing to say that. And they went in their thousands to sign lists to get him on the ballot. And Mr. Putin said, I'm not going to have it. Not going to have that kind of competition. Take him off the ballot. And so he's off the ballot for some unspecified reason. So the Navalny issue demonstrates the kind of regime that we're dealing with domestically. We know his actions internationally in Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. And it's interesting because when we discuss Alexei Navalny, it's difficult not to remember, you know, all the statements from the European Union, you know, and all these entities, you know, about the situation of Navalny. And also the European Union has reacted, you know, very proactively, you know, against the war in many ways. They've adopted a lot of measures, and now there's also this process, you know, of accession, you know, of the Ukraine to the European Union. You know, what do you think could be, you know, the outcome, you know, of all of these processes around the European Union and all this activity?
It's a good question, and you asked what the result of the Navalny death is. Well, here, so both here and in Europe, it's two very good questions. Here, it has refocused attention on Ukraine and refocused attention on the crimes of Russia. And right now, our Congress, in particular our House of Representatives, is making a decision about how and whether to continue the support for Ukraine in its fight against the Russians, and how to defend itself against the Russians with what kind of weapons, what kind of support can it expect from the United States. And the Navalny death, again, just highlighted the problem on the Russian side. It by implication, allows us to look at the Ukrainian side and see the values that the Ukrainians stand for and that they're fighting for and that they are trying to establish in their own country, which gets to the Europe question. The Ukrainians have been seeking membership in the European Union and in NATO. I'll come back to NATO. And in fact, it was this effort to sign an association agreement with the European Union in 2013 that triggered the Revolution of Dignity when the Russian-leaning Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, when he was about to sign this association agreement in the fall of 2013, President Putin said, what? Not so fast. And Putin bribed Yanukovych with $15 billion in low gas prices, and Yanukovych bent to it, turned around, decided not to, and the Ukrainian people, gets to your point, Ukrainian people resisted, revolted. They went to the streets, not just in Kyiv, but certainly in Kyiv, in their hundreds of thousands, in their millions across the country, demanding dignity. This was a revolution of dignity that they were asking for. Getting rid of corruption, but also it was also known as the Euromaidan, because they wanted to join the European Union. The values that the European Union represent to Ukrainians are the goal, are where they want to be. They are the values of the Ukrainians, and they want to join that community. So you're exactly right. The European Union, in June of 2022, so a couple of months after the invasion, extended candidate status. And then just a couple of months ago, back in December, they said, yes, you've gotten far enough, you can start the negotiations toward membership. And that's been the goal of the Ukrainians. And it's a demonstration that seeking that is definitely possible. Let me just say a word about NATO. The Ukrainians recognize now that NATO is their ultimate security. The Finns and the Swedes figured this out very quickly once the Russians invaded Ukraine. And they immediately applied for membership in NATO because neutrality, which they had been for generations, obviously doesn't work. They applied, the Finns got in right away, the Swedes just got in over the last couple of days, thanks to Hungary. And the Ukrainians see that as the model on how they want to go. And they say, look, we know that Ukraine can't join NATO in the middle of a war. That is not going to work, and we can talk about that. But if NATO makes the same offer to the Ukrainians that the European Union did, that is, you're going to be in, start negotiations, NATO could start the negotiations with Ukraine toward membership, and they could announce that this summer at a summit. There's a NATO, the 75th anniversary of NATO summit is going to be right here. So that could be, so all to say that the European destination of Ukraine has become clearer and clearer, and they're on the way as far as they're concerned.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask you a connected question, and this also comes from our students. You know, many of us are in the classroom, we're discussing this war periodically, you know, and one of the main questions is, what is the impact of this war on international affairs? You know, what are the main repercussions of this war on international affairs? And basically, after 2 years, you know, of this ongoing conflict, what do you think would be, you know, the most important aspects to highlight? And we have a number of students in the room, you know, so these are questions that we're discussing in classrooms. I teach international law of human rights, and on Thursday we're actually having a discussion of human rights in extremis and armed conflicts, and this is going to be one of the biggest points of discussion. You know, when you have a conflict like this, you know, what happens to the rest of the global order?
It's a great question. It's exactly the right question. I mentioned earlier that there was a global order that, not perfect, but it succeeded in preventing a major war among powers, big powers in Europe and in the world. And that was violated. And the question for international lawyers and international politicians and publics is how to get back to that. But you're right, it's broader than just Ukraine. Take China. President Xi is undoubtedly watching very carefully what happens in Ukraine. He's probably a bit surprised that the international community, the Western community, has defended Ukraine so successfully, has supported Ukraine so successfully, that has stayed together in terms of sanctions, in terms of economic support, in terms of military support. The Chinese did not think that the United States or the West was able to do that, was able to maintain that support. They looked at our withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, which was in August of 2021. And they, and probably President Putin, both said, the Americans don't have the staying power, the stomach. So we can take some advantage of that. And the Russians clearly did. My view, the Russians made a big mistake. And that coalition that the United States pulled together in response to that invasion demonstrated that we were there, that we could put together that kind of coalition, those kinds of sanctions, that kind of support, that kind of military support. And President Xi is noticing that too. And if we can provide that support, if our Congress, if our House of Representatives right now, this week, can figure out a way to have a vote on this bill that has passed the Senate, bipartisan, 70-29 in the Senate, with 22 Republicans joining most of the Democrats. If that can get a vote in the House, then that will demonstrate to the Chinese, to the Ukrainians, but to the Russians as well, and to the Europeans, other allies, that they can count on us. So this does have implications for our leadership in international relations. It has implications for the order that we talked about. So this is a very important vote right here this week that the Congress is now facing.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor. And I just have one final question before we open this dialogue to the audience. And it's actually, it has two components, What do you think is important to have victory, in this situation? What do you think is important to have peace in this situation? And do you think that we can reconcile both in this war?
Victory and peace. That's exactly right. So, what is victory? What is winning? When you ask the Ukrainians, they're very clear. They have a simple answer. It's hard to achieve, but it's a simple answer. Just get the Russians out of our country. They just want the Russians out of Ukraine. That's victory for them. How does that come about? It comes about over time. I mean, the Ukrainians recognize that this is not something that the first year of the war went pretty well for the Ukrainians. The second year has been more of a stalemate. So the Ukrainians recognize that this new warfare, and we've learned a lot about warfare in this past year. This new warfare is not amenable to big breakthroughs. In the last year, that's been shown, both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. Ukrainians tried to break through last June, didn't work. The Russians have been trying, they're making a little bit of progress over the past couple of weeks. Why? Because the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. Why? Because the Americans haven't been providing the support that they thought they would do. But we might, if we can make this vote happen, then the Ukrainians can hold back. But it's still going to be static. It's going to be static. So victory is not going to be immediate. They're going to try to do two things. One is push the Russians back. But the second is they recognize that there could be some diplomatic, some negotiations after they have pushed the Russians back to enable them to achieve a victory. Victory is, yes, the Russians out, but it's a just and lasting peace. And there's the second part of your question. The Ukrainians could get peace right now. Ukrainians could compromise. They could say, okay, ceasefire right where you are to the Russians, and the Russians could then occupy for a long period of time, maybe forever, 20% of the Ukrainian country. And not just 20% of the Ukrainian territory, it's 20% of the Ukrainian people, which is what the Ukrainians don't want to happen. They know what happens to Ukrainians who live under Russian occupation. They saw it in Bucha, and it's horrible. And they don't want that for their Ukrainian compatriots. So the Ukrainians are not willing to have a peace at any price with a compromise that would cede a fifth of their country to horrors of Russian occupation. So a just and lasting peace is important, and that's consistent with victory. How does that happen? It happens with some military support, frankly, and then some conversations, probably over time. It's probably all of the solution to this war will not happen in 6 months or a year. It may take 5 years. There have been suggestions, for example, that the Ukrainians and Russians could agree to a demilitarized Crimea. So the Russians would not have the military forces in Crimea, and therefore couldn't stop trade, which is what happens if their military forces are in Crimea. They can dominate the Black Sea. But if there was demilitarized Crimea, then over time, they could work things toward a just and lasting peace. The Ukrainians would not ever give up claim to Crimea, but they would say, we don't have to have it tomorrow. We don't have to have it in a year. We'd be willing to have this conversation. That's just one idea that has come out. But what is important is that a just and lasting peace is the goal. That's the victory. If there's a ceasefire or a compromise, that allows the Russians to stay, then they are almost sure to pursue it again, to invade again, to push again, and try to take over. Mr. Putin has been very clear about his ultimate goal, and that is to dominate Ukraine, to bring Ukraine back into Russia. He argues, both in writing and in speeches, that there's no such thing as Ukraine. There's not a Ukraine. And therefore, he's just going to take it back. He's going to take it over. And so a just and lasting peace has to provide security for Ukraine, and it has to recognize these principles that will mean that they can't invade again.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, for agreeing to join us today, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise on this situation. It's a very complex context, but I have to say we learned tremendously today of what the stakes are, in this situation. And I want to open it for questions in the audience. Durrani.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Durrani Waziri. I am an LLM student, and I think I can talk. You will hear.
We can hear you. We can hear
Yes. Okay. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Durrani Waziri, and I am from Afghanistan. I'm an LLM student. Back in Afghanistan, I was the spokesperson to President Ashraf Ghani and also chief legal advisor to the National Council Security Council. Also, I have work experience with the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan for a few years. So I just explained my background because I want to tell you that I am fully equipped with the experience of this kind of relationship between the U.S. and other countries. My question is that, Mr. Ambassador, what do you think about the future of Ukraine, especially if there might be kind of changes here in DC administration? I mean, if we have the new president, who knows? Because I do remember on 2001 when the U.S. president was George W. Bush, and the same kind of commitment was for Afghanistan. And there was support, there was sending weapons, all these things. But after years, and you know better than me that we had hundred thousands of U.S. soldiers and also NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. But when President Donald Trump became a president, and the situation has been changed, and then he clearly said that we are not police in Afghanistan, and that is it. Even we had BSA, about that we had according to the international law, even it was wrong to just dismiss that BSA with Afghanistan, even just from one side, which was from the U.S. government side. Recently, I'm following all these politics on all these debates that the president candidates have in the United States, and when I'm listening to them, President Donald Trump says that if I become president, so the situation will be changed regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that the situation will be not very positive. And who knows, maybe he will just stop the support of the U.S. to Ukraine. So what do you think? How you evaluate the situation? How you see the future of Ukraine if in case there is kind of changes in the administration? Thank you.
Two things. I also worked for Ashraf Ghani when I was in Kabul.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know which years.
I do know what years. 2002 to 2003.
I was a student at that time.
Before your time. That's exactly right. But the second, your question is a good one. What happens to Ukraine if there's a change in administration here?
Yes.
First of all, we don't know what a new administration, what the policy would be. Full stop. I mean, we don't know. There have been confusing statements or vague statements about this. So it's not entirely clear. But number two, when you ask what will happen to Ukraine, Ukraine will continue to fight. Ukraine will continue to defend itself as best it can. There will be other nations that will continue to support them. The Europeans, let's be clear, the Europeans have provided more support to Ukraine than the United States has.
Yes, I know.
And they will continue. Now, it is true that our military support is more available. I mean, we've got stockpiles, deep stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that we can take and send to Ukraine. The Europeans don't have the same depth of those stockpiles of weapons, but they are building the capacity. The Ukrainians are building the capacity. The Europeans are building the capacity to be able to provide the Ukrainians with what they need in order to continue to fight. Ukrainians will defend. They have nowhere to go. Ukrainians say, well, of course we're going to fight. There's no place we can go. The Dean mentioned that Putin has said that he's going to eliminate Ukraine. So the Ukrainians know what they're fighting for. They need the United States. They know that. The first thing they all say when you have conversations, so I've been there many times, 6 times since the big war, but a bunch of times before that. And the first thing they say when they sit down with Americans is, thank you. Thank you for the support that you've given us. They count on us, and they're looking to what happens in the House of Representatives this week. They're counting on that. They'll continue to fight. There is no doubt in their minds and no doubt in my mind that they will continue to fight. The Russians now occupy roughly 20% of the country. 80% of the country is not occupied. That 80% will continue to fight and will continue to push toward a democratic future and will continue to push toward Europe, as we were just talking. That will continue. There is no doubt. They have a better chance of defeating the Russians and pushing them back out if we continue to provide them the military support.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador and Professor Celorio. I will ask about question about the Navalny, Alexei Navalny.
Navalny. The people here in the back? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So before and after death of Navalny, Putin weaponized his past. This includes support for annexation of Crimea back in 2014, support for the Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, racist remarks against the people of the post-Soviet republics. I know we all make mistakes, and Navalny has apologized what he said in the past, has condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Yet, when you talk with ordinary people from post-Soviet space, some people were still skeptical about the Navalny because of the past. Now, my question is, what's your take on what's the best way to fight Russian propaganda about Navalny?
So you're right that many people in the nations around Russia, in that space that you described, remember what Navalny said earlier on in his career. The Ukrainians remember what he said early on in his career, and you mentioned it. He did not condemn the invasion of Crimea. And then you're also right that he kind of changed his mind. And so someone asked Navalny, well, you've changed your mind on Crimea, would you give it back? And he said, what is Crimea, like a bologna sandwich or something? He said, so he has flirted with this extreme nationalism that many Russians are prone to. At the same time. So Navalny's a politician, was a politician, a good one. He had his ear to the people. And there is a nationalistic strain in Russians that he appealed to as he was getting going. But you're also right. He did change. And he did recognize the criminality of this invasion. in 2022, and strongly opposed it. And I think he's got a parent is Ukrainian. One half, so he's half Ukrainian. You know, one parent Ukrainian, one Russian. So he understood that situation there. And how do we address the propaganda, the news, the story that the Kremlin will put out? We just, like on all things, we just have to tell the truth. We have to just be able to say over and over what we understand, what the truth is, and people will listen. In the end, people will listen. Thank you.
Patrick.
Hi, Ambassador, and thank you for coming to speak. So I'm curious on your view regarding sanctions and the efficacy of sanctions, and which sanctions you think have been most effective at altering the Russian strategy in Ukraine, and going forward, what sanctions you think should be increased and which ones you think maybe actually do not help the cause?
It's a great question. So on sanctions, there, among some people, maybe even people in the government, in our government, there was this thought early on that if the sanctions were so clear and so harsh, that they might deter Putin from invading. So President Biden actually called Putin twice and essentially threatened Putin with severe sanctions. I mean, he described these sanctions to Putin as being the harshest on any country in the history of sanctions. And he may have thought, President Biden may have thought, that President Putin would evaluate the cost and benefits of invading and would decide he wasn't going to invade. Well, it didn't happen. And the sanctions were put on. President Biden came through on those sanctions, and they were harsh. And they, knocked the Russians out of the financial system in the world, the SWIFT system, put export controls on microchips and semiconductors, trying to reduce the ability of the Russians to manufacture weapons. This is what sanctions can do, and what they've been kind of marginally effective at doing. That is reducing the ability of the Russian economy to sustain the war. They haven't been able to deter it. You asked about what sanctions should go forward and be increased. One of the big ones, and this gets to international law, you will like this, Dean. When President Biden threatened President Putin with severe sanctions, President Putin felt pretty good about this because he had $600 billion in Russian central bank reserves that he could use as a cushion if these sanctions were indeed imposed, as President Biden was saying. But it turns out that of that $600 billion in Russian central bank reserves, $300 billion is in Western banks. It's in G7 banks. Those $300 billion have been frozen. So the Russians can't get at that. The sanction that we should impose next is to actually seize those $330 billion, put them in an international fund that would help reconstruct Ukraine. The justice of that would be that the Russians would be paying for the damage that they caused. This fund could also help fund the Ukrainian government, could even buy weapons if it were to come to that. But that's the big sanction that I think. Now, over the past weekend, the administration and allies, by the way, the amazing thing about sanctions has been the degree to which we've been able to coordinate with allies. And sanctions work best when a lot of nations impose them. And so that's been a major effort of the Biden administration's effort on sanctions. But if that can happen, if we can coordinate with allies times, in particular on this 300 billion. Part of the argument against doing that is, well, if we seize those assets, then will the international community, Chinese, others, take their money out of US banks and put them somewhere else? Well, if the allies have all done the same thing, there's no place for the Chinese to put their money. I mean, there's no other places. They could put it in British pounds, but if the Brits are along with this seizure, or they can put it in the euro. You know, you get the point that the coordination of these sanctions is really important. So that would be the one that I would emphasize. I don't think we should be relaxing sanctions until the Russians do what they did to impose these sanctions, to deserve these sanctions. That is, they invaded first Crimea, some sanctions there, and then when they invaded big time, big sanctions. If they withdraw their troops, then the sanctions can start to go off.
Thank you.
I think we have reached the end of our time. And thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, for all of your thoughts, all of your wisdom, for collaborating with our law school and our students. You know, thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think all of you know that we have lunch, you know, so please help yourselves, and we have a break until 1:30, and then we're going to continue the discussion with Professor Sean Murphy and our distinguished panelists of experts. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Ambassador Taylor.
Thank you.